Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to hear from our American friend TJ, and she's got some more questions for us. TJ?
Hi, Dale. So, I am curious about many things during this election period, but one thing I have become even more curious about in the last 24 hours is what happens in the first 24 hours after an election in Canada. Because it occurred to me that I had no idea of the actual timelines. Like, is it as of midnight? Does someone have to concede for the election to be over? And what time do the polls even close? Is it all the same time? Is it all different times across the country? So yeah, I just love to hear some more details about what next week is going to look like for the country.
Okay. First off, polls generally close around close to the same time around the country. The Atlantic provinces start slightly later in the day. BC starts slightly earlier, and most of the polls close within an hour or so around each other around the country. So there's an attempt to try and get a fair amount of uniformity in terms of when people are voting, so you don't get too much of this situation of the time zones basically impacting. We used to have a system of media blackouts around that, so you couldn't report what the polls were showing as they closed in one province but were still going on in the other. That's kind of been done away with now because it's just too hard to maintain. But they've kind of made the staggered hours enough that there's not much difference between them across the country. So that's polling. At that point, we have to remember that the Prime Minister is still the Prime Minister. So what it means is that he remains the Prime Minister until he signals that he's going to resign. So when we start seeing the results, if it's a majority against his party and their seats, then yeah, it's going to be likely that he'll say, yes, there's no way I can maintain government or confidence in this kind of situation. So I'm going to signal my intention to resign. He doesn't actually resign until right before the next Prime Minister is sworn in, because the Governor General and the Queen always need someone to give them advice. But it would be the signal that yes, I will resign, and the Governor General can at that point ask someone else to form a government. So that's kind of what's going to be in the kind of 24 hours after the election is who can maintain confidence. Because the polls are so close, there's all this talk about what a minority situation will look like. Even if the Liberals don't win the most seats, there's always the possibility that they can come to some kind of agreement with other parties in order to maintain confidence and maintain government. They might come up with an agreement, that those other parties will support them for 18 months or 2 years. And that will kind of give Parliament a chance to at least get a few things done before we start thinking about going to the polls again.
So you can actually end up with sort of a conditional coalition, and it kind of ensures that you don't literally end up in the polls again a week later or 5 days, whatever it is. Because I was actually curious about that, because how quickly could there conceivably be another election, technically?
Technically, the most technical is it could be right away. But the convention in Canada and how governors general tend to operate is they try and keep one from happening within 6 months. And they will try and ensure that there's some manner of cooperation in order to at least have something that can at least pass the estimates in the supply cycle. Because Governor General special warrants only last for so long before they need Parliament to give more money to government to function. So that's part of the consideration, but yeah, 6 months tends to be what the rule of thumb is.
And then I would imagine that if you and your party were sort of holding that up and making it impossible to do, you wouldn't do too well when the actual election happened the next time, right? Because you'd be throwing the spanner in being the spanner in the works even.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. And this thing with the rolling sort of adjustment of polling stations closing. Do we call them stations here?
We call them stations, yeah.
Okay. It's really interesting because culturally we have this thing in the US, and especially since I grew up on the West Coast, of watching the states close. Polls have closed in this part of the country, in this part, that so-and-so's calling whatever, Michigan, Ohio. And it does build up this momentum towards, California and its 50-something votes, or electoral college votes. And on that note, I've pretty much forgotten all of this stuff about electoral reform that Trudeau was mentioning when I first arrived in this country. But what would look different right now if he had done whatever it was he said he was going to do with the electoral process reform?
That's hard to say because we don't really know what system would have been put in place. I mean, he had preferred a ranked ballot system, which wouldn't have changed anything materially in that regard. A proportional representation system, if it's partially list-based or something, I don't know, again, that it would do as much because it's you still have riding level votes as well as party votes, which don't get allocated until all the votes are in. So I don't know that there would be any kind of cumulative impact, at least not in terms of time zones and whatnot. And that would also rely on people in BC waiting until the last minute to go to the polls, as opposed to kind of doing it earlier in the day, which has kind of been how culturally BC has adapted to just the way in which our country works in as many time zones as we have.
That's really interesting. And given the potential outcomes of coalitions and minorities and tenuous majorities that everybody seems to be reporting on, do you think there will be a call for another category of electoral reform again after this? Is there anything that you think would make a positive impact on, I guess, the ultimate goal of true representation of the will of the people?
I mean, as part of conditions for cooperation, the NDP and the Greens might insist on some kind of electoral reform issue, but I think we essentially find ourselves in the same place we did in the last Parliament. They would have another study of some variety. The Conservatives would demand a referendum on it, and even if we got that far, it's almost certain the referendum would fail because every single provincial referendum on electoral reform we've had in this country has failed. So I don't think we'll really get anywhere with that. I can't think of a system that would, any system would likely make minority parliaments more common than less, and would require some level of actual coalitions rather than cooperation. And that, again, can lead to, some people think it's going to be everyone cooperates and it's nice and it's harmonious, and that's not necessarily the case. It can mean, where smaller fringe parties break off of the Big Ten parties that we have now, we won't have the same parties running when the incentives are different. And that will create just problems with the math. So I can't see how that would make anything necessarily better in terms of this kind of a situation.
Oh, well, that is really interesting. I've been keeping my eye on the Democratic primaries these days with the people to the south, and I don't know what kind of reform we can offer ourselves after this election coming up. We still have a year to go, so I'm looking forward to only having to think about one election after next week, unless we have that worst case scenario with another one declared right away. But thanks for answering my questions, Dale.
Always a pleasure. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.